When Grace's bakery faces closure, she refuses charity, choosing faith over fear.
The bell above the bakery door jingled softly, a gentle sound that always reminded Grace Bennett of Sunday mornings in her grandmother's kitchen. But this was a Tuesday. The rain had been falling since dawn, and the smell of cinnamon and fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies lingered in the air like a warm blanket. She was wiping down the glass display case when he walked in, tall, immaculately dressed in a charcoal overcoat, his umbrella dripping rainwater onto the mat. Grace had never seen him before, but something about the way he carried himself told her he wasn't from Willow Creek. He didn't browse the shelves or study the chalkboard menu. Instead, he went straight to the far corner booth, sat down, and pulled out his phone. Grace almost smiled. People usually came to Sweet Grace's bakery for conversation, not for solitude. She approached his table with her notepad. "What can I get for you?" He didn't look up. "Chocolate chip cookies and coffee, black." Grace nodded, jotting it down. "We have a fresh batch just out of the oven. 3 or 6? His eyes flicked up, cool and unreadable. 12. That caught her off guard. "A dozen cookies?" He set his phone aside. "They're for my son. He likes them." His voice softened for a fraction of a second, then went back to its clipped, businesslike tone. Grace smiled politely, heading back to the counter. The man was unusual, but she'd learned not to judge. People came to her bakery for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. Some for comfort, some for routine, and some because the scent of sugar and butter could feel like a prayer answered. A few minutes later, she brought the cookies and coffee to his booth. He handed her a sleek black credit card, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies. "First time in Willow Creek?" she asked. "Yes." He took a sip of coffee, then seemed to reconsider. "I'll be back next week, same time." It wasn't a question, and before Grace could respond, he was gone, the bell above the door jingling once more. The next Tuesday he returned, same order, same corner booth, and the week after that, Grace learned his name was Daniel Whitmore, but little else. He wasn't chatty, he didn't linger, but each week he left with a white bakery box tied in twine and a faint hint of something unspoken in his eyes. It was the 4th Tuesday when everything changed. He arrived later than usual, rain-soaked and distracted. He placed the box of cookies on the booth table, opened the lid, and took out one himself. "That's new," Grace teased from behind the counter. "Never seen you eat one before." He shrugged. "I don't usually eat sweets, but my son calls these the taste of home." His voice caught slightly, and Grace noticed how his hand lingered on the box as if it were more than just cookies inside. Something told her there was a story there, one heavy with loss and guarded with care. She decided not to push. Instead, she offered a quiet smile and said, "You're welcome here anytime." When he left, Grace noticed the smallest thing, a neatly folded note under his empty coffee cup. She opened it and found 6 words written in a precise, almost hesitant hand. "You remind me of my faith." It was the first time in years she felt her hands tremble while holding a piece of paper. The following Tuesday, Daniel arrived with someone new, a boy of about 8 with neatly combed hair and eyes too solemn for his age. He didn't look at Grace when she came to the table. "This is Ethan," Daniel said, his tone softer than Grace had ever heard it. "Ethan, this is Miss Bennett. She makes the cookies." Ethan nodded politely but didn't speak. His hand stayed folded in his lap. Grace crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "I hear you like these." She opened the bakery box and slid it toward him. He took one, nibbling slowly. After a moment, his shoulders eased just enough to let out a quiet, almost whispered, "They're the best." Grace's smile warmed. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The rest of the visit was quiet, but before leaving, Ethan glanced back at her and said, "Bye, Cookie Fairy." Daniel looked surprised. Grace just laughed. "See you next week." Over the next few weeks, Ethan came with Daniel every time. Slowly, his words grew from 1-2 to full sentences, especially when talking about the cookies. One rainy afternoon, Daniel lingered after Ethan went to the counter to look at the other pastries. "You're good with him," Daniel said. Grace shrugged. "Kids like cookies, and people need a place to feel safe. That's what I try to make here." Daniel's eyes studied her. "It's rare. I don't see many people live out their faith so plainly." Grace chuckled softly. "Faith isn't something I hide away. It's my recipe for life." For the first time, Daniel smiled, small but genuine. "Maybe that's why he likes you." One Thursday, Grace wore a delicate silver cross around her neck, a piece she rarely took out. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Is that new?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "It was my mother's. She wore it every day until she passed. She used to say it reminded her that God was always near, even when life felt heavy." Ethan touched the pendant lightly. "Does it work?" he asked. Grace met his gaze. "It does. Not because it's magic, but because it helps me remember to trust him." Daniel listened quietly, his eyes shadowed. Later, as they left, Ethan tugged his father's hand. "Can we come again, sooner than next Tuesday?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. The joy of their visits was interrupted one Friday morning when Grace received a letter from the bank. The bakery was 3 months behind on payments. Without immediate action, she could lose it. She sat in the back room, the letter trembling in her hands. This bakery was more than a business. It was her late mother's dream, the place where Grace had poured every prayer and ounce of hope she had left.
That afternoon, Daniel and Ethan arrived unexpectedly. Daniel noticed her red eyes immediately. "What happened?" Grace shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle." But Ethan's small voice cut through the silence. "Cookie Fairy, are you sad?" Grace forced a smile, just a little storm to get through. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Storms are easier when you don't face them alone." Grace looked at him, realizing for the first time that the man in the corner booth wasn't just a customer anymore. He was someone God had perhaps sent for a reason. The next Tuesday, Daniel arrived without Ethan. His expression was unreadable as he ordered the usual cookies and coffee. After a pause, he slid a folded check across the table toward Grace. "This should cover the bakery's overdue payments," he said simply. Grace blinked. "How do you?" Daniel replied, "I asked around. You've given a lot to this community. It's time someone gave back." She pushed the check back toward him. "I can't accept this. If I keep this place, it has to be because I earned it, not because someone rescued me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You'd rather lose it than accept help?" "I'd rather trust God's timing than skip the part where he teaches me something through the trial." For the first time, Daniel looked almost impressed. He tucked the check away without another word. Later that week, Grace decided to try something different. She invited Ethan to help her in the kitchen. He showed up on Saturday morning with Daniel in tow. She handed Ethan an apron and a mixing bowl. "This," she said, pouring sugar into the bowl, "is where all good things begin." As they worked, Ethan giggled when flour puffed into the air, dusting his nose. Daniel stood at the doorway, watching his son laugh, a sound he hadn't heard this freely in years. When the batch was done, Grace told Ethan, "Every cookie you bake today will sell for the bakery fund. That way, you help keep this place alive." Ethan's chest puffed proudly. "Then I'm going to make 100. Daniel smiled faintly. "You might just save her bakery before I do." One rainy evening, the bakery was nearly empty. Ethan was reading in the corner, and Daniel lingered after his coffee. "My wife loved baking," Daniel said suddenly. "She used to make cookies with Ethan every Sunday. After she passed, he wouldn't go near the kitchen." Grace listened quietly. "I thought I was protecting him by avoiding it, but watching him in here, laughing, it's like I got a piece of him back." Grace's eyes softened. Maybe God knew cookies could do more than feed a sweet tooth. Daniel gave a small laugh, the kind that sounded almost like relief. Maybe he did. Grace decided to host a Saturday bake sale to raise money for the bakery. The church offered the fellowship hall, and half the town showed up. Ethan manned the cookie table, proudly telling each customer, "I helped make these." Daniel stood beside Grace, helping with transactions. At one point, he leaned down and murmured, "This feels good, like we're on the same team." By the end of the day, they'd raised enough to cover 1 month's payment. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was hope. As they packed up, Daniel caught her gaze. "Grace, if you ever let me help, I promise I won't take away your fight. I'll just stand beside you." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. One late night after closing, Grace stayed behind to clean. She sank into a booth, exhaustion pressing heavy on her. The bank's deadline loomed. She bowed her head. "Lord, if you want this bakery to stay, show me the way, and if you want me to let it go, help me do it with peace." When she opened her eyes, she saw a small sticky note on the table, one she didn't remember placing. In careful handwriting, it read, "Faith is the flour, love is the sugar, together they rise." She smiled faintly. Ethan's handwriting. And just like that, she knew she wasn't in this alone. Not with a boy who believed in her, and maybe even a man who was starting too. It started small, a whisper overheard in the grocery store, a comment on social media. By Friday, Grace heard it directly. She's just cozying up to Daniel Whitmore for his money. She froze when she read the post online, a blurry photo of her and Daniel at the bake sale, accompanied by the caption, "Local baker knows which billionaire to butter up." She could brush off gossip when it was about her, but this could hurt Daniel. Worse, it could damage the trust she'd built with Ethan. When Daniel arrived that afternoon, she showed him the post. He studied it without expression. "It doesn't matter," he said at last. "It matters to me," Grace insisted. "I won't let people think that's why I'm helping you or why you're helping me." Daniel's voice dropped. Then maybe it's time they see the truth for themselves. The next Sunday, Daniel did something unexpected. He brought Ethan to Grace's church. The congregation murmured as the billionaire and his son took seats beside the bakery owner. When the pastor invited testimonies, Daniel stood. His voice was even, but his words were like a hammer breaking glass. "I've heard people say, 'Grace is after my money.' They're wrong. She's after something far more valuable, my son's smile, and she's given it back to him." Grace blinked back tears. The room was silent, except for the sound of Ethan slipping his hand into hers. After the service, no one whispered anymore. Ethan began spending more afternoons at the bakery, learning recipes and helping Grace serve customers. One rainy day, they worked on a new creation, cinnamon maple cookies. "We'll sell these as a special," Grace told him, "and you can name them." Ethan thought for a moment. "Faith cookies." Daniel, leaning against the counter, arched a brow. "Why?" "Because Grace says faith is what makes things rise." Daniel's gaze lingered on Grace, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes was something she couldn't quite name, something warm that might be dangerous if she let herself hope.
One evening, as Grace was closing up, a man appeared at the door, tall, with a smirk she recognized instantly. Her ex, Tyler. "You've done well," he said, glancing around. "Heard you've got a rich boyfriend now." Grace stiffened. "Leave." Tyler stepped closer. "You still own me from when I loaned you money for this place." "That was a gift, not a loan," Grace said firmly. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Then maybe your billionaire friend would like to pay me to stay quiet about your past mistakes." Daniel arrived moments later, freezing at the sight of them. Tyler smirked and walked out without a word. "Who was that?" Daniel asked. Grace swallowed hard. "Someone I'd rather forget." The next morning, Daniel returned early, before the bakery opened. "You don't have to tell me, but I need to know if he's a threat to you." Grace poured coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I made mistakes before I knew who I was in God. Tyler wasn't good for me. He left me in debt and almost cost me the bakery once before." Daniel's jaw tightened. "If he comes back—" "I can handle him," Grace interrupted. "I've learned to stand on my own." Daniel's voice softened. "I know you can, but sometimes strength means letting someone stand with you." Grace met his gaze. "And sometimes faith means believing God's already standing there."
Daniel smiled faintly, a smile that held more than gratitude. It held the first spark of something neither of them dared name just yet. It was 2 weeks before Tyler reappeared. Grace was locking up the bakery when she saw him leaning casually against her car. "Thought you might have reconsidered," he said. "I haven't." Tyler shrugged. "Your choice, but I wonder how that billionaire would feel if he knew you used to pawn your grandmother's silver for rent money." Grace's breath caught. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would, unless you make it worth my while." Before Grace could respond, a deep voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel stepped out of the shadows, his expression carved from stone. Tyler backed off, muttering, "No problem, not yet." Grace wanted to protest, to say she could handle it, but when Daniel's hand brushed hers lightly, she didn't pull away. The next day, Daniel didn't bring up Tyler. Instead, he stopped by with Ethan and 2 large grocery bags. "We're making dinner here," he announced. "Here? In the bakery?" Grace blinked. "Why not?" Daniel said, already unpacking pasta sauce and salad ingredients. Ethan grinned. "Dad's trying to make spaghetti without burning it." The evening was filled with laughter, clinking pans on the warm scent of garlic bread. By the time they were done, the bakery felt less like a shop and more like a home. As they cleaned up, Daniel caught Grace's eye. "You don't have to keep me at arm's length forever." Grace hesitated. "Trust is like bread dough. It needs time to rise." Daniel smiled. "Then I'm not in a hurry." The following Saturday, Ethan burst into the bakery early, a frown on his face. "Dad forgot to bring cookies home last night," he said gravely. "The jar is empty." Grace laughed and packed a fresh box. Crisis averted. Ethan leaned closer. "You make Dad smile. That's why I call you the cookie fairy. You make magic happen." Grace's chest tightened. "Sweetheart, sometimes God uses people to bring joy back into our lives. Maybe that's all I'm doing." Ethan grinned. "Then you're God's cookie fairy." Daniel, overhearing, shook his head with a quiet chuckle. But in his eyes, Grace saw a truth he hadn't yet spoken out loud. Grace came in early Monday morning to find the bakery's front window cracked. On the door, taped in place, was a note. "Sell the bakery or else." Her hands trembled as she called the police. By the time Daniel arrived, she was sweeping up glass. "You think it was Tyler?" he asked. Grace nodded. "But I can't prove it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then I'll make sure you're never here alone again." Grace wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need guarding, but when Ethan appeared at the door, eyes wide, she realized this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who called this place safe. That Sunday, Grace stood up at church and asked for prayer, not for the bakery's finances, but for courage. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she said, "but I know who holds tomorrow, and I believe no threat, no storm, can undo what God has begun." Daniel and Ethan sat in the second row listening. When the service ended, Ethan hugged her fiercely. Daniel lingered. "You don't just talk about faith, you live it, and I'm starting to believe it too." Grace smiled softly. "That's how it works, one heart at a time." They walked out together into the sunlight, unaware that the coming week would test that faith more than ever before. The week began with another blow. Grace arrived at the bakery to find the register open and the cash missing. A single cookie sat on the counter, crushed into crumbs. A mocking message. Officer Ramirez confirmed what Grace already suspected. Your ex fits the pattern, but without a camera or witness, it's hard to prove. When Daniel came by, she tried to play it down. "It's just money. I can replace that." His eyes hardened. "Grace, this isn't just about money anymore. This is intimidation. I'm putting a security team here." She shook her head. "Daniel, no arguments," he said firmly. "You've given enough of yourself to everyone else. Let someone stand for you now." Grace didn't answer, but something in his voice made her feel for the first time she wasn't fighting this battle alone. When Ethan heard about the break-in, he had an idea. "Let's have a concert. You play the piano, Grace, and Dad can invite his friends." Daniel raised a brow. "You play piano?"
A week later, the bakery transformed into a warm-lit venue. Daniel's network filled the seats, and Grace sat at the small upright piano by the window. Her fingers trembled at first, But then she closed her eyes and prayed silently. Lord, let this music carry hope. She played hymns woven with soft, tender melodies. Ethan joined her on a few notes, his small hands pressing the keys carefully. When the night ended, they'd raised enough to pay off another month. But more than that, Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her as the last chord faded. 2 days after the concert, Grace stayed late to clean. The bell over the door rang, and Tyler stepped inside, his smile cold. "Nice show you put on. Must have made a good haul." Grace's voice stayed steady. "Leave." Tyler stepped closer. "Or maybe I'll take a cut, since I'm part of your history." Suddenly, another voice cut in. "She told you to leave." Daniel stood in the doorway, his stance rigid. Tyler's smirk faltered. "This isn't over," Tyler muttered, backing away. Daniel didn't move until the door closed behind him. "I think it is," he said quietly, but Grace could tell by his eyes that he knew it wasn't. Not yet. That Friday night, a heavy storm rolled in. Grace had just finished mopping when the lights flickered and went out. A knock came at the door, sharp, insistent. She hesitated before opening it a crack. Tyler stood there, drenched, his eyes wild. "I need money, now." Before she could react, Tyler's SUV pulled up, headlights cutting through the rain. He was out in seconds, stepping between them. "Leave before I call the police," Daniel warned. Tyler laughed bitterly. "You think you own her now? You think money makes her your savior?" Daniel's voice was low, but unshaken. "No, but I'll stand here until she's safe." Tyler glared, then turned and disappeared into the rain. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet streets into mirrors of gold. Grace stood at the bakery window, coffee in hand, watching the lights spill in. Daniel came in quietly with Ethan. The boy ran to her with a grin. "Guess what? Dad says we're having breakfast here every Saturday now." Grace smiled. "I'd like that." When Daniel joined her at the counter, he said, "He's gone. Ramirez picked him up last night for outstanding warrants. He won't bother you again." Grace let out a long breath. "Thank you." Daniel's gaze softened. "You don't owe me thanks. You've given me and my son something I didn't think we'd have again. A place that feels like home." For the first time, Grace didn't shy away from the warmth rising between them. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. Grace was pulling trays of warm cookies from the oven when Ethan bounded in. "Grace, Dad says you have to come to our house for dinner tonight." She laughed. "Oh, does he now?" Daniel stepped in behind him, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "It's not a demand. It's an invitation. You've done so much for us here. I thought maybe it was time we returned the gesture." Grace hesitated. "Daniel, I don't want this to be transactional." He finished. "It's not. It's personal." The warmth in his voice sent a flicker of something through her chest. She nodded. "All right, but only if I bring dessert." That evening, she walked into Daniel's home carrying a basket of cookies still warm from the oven. Ethan pulled her toward the dining room, chattering about the spaghetti he and his dad had made together. Over dinner, the laughter came easily, the pauses comfortable. Later, while Ethan played in the living room, Daniel said quietly, "I never believed God cared about the details of my life, but then you walked into it and the details are all I can see." She swallowed hard. "Maybe he knew you needed cookies to notice." A week later, the bakery bustled with customers. Grace was at the counter when Daniel and Ethan walked in, both looking suspiciously pleased with themselves. "Can we show her now?" Ethan asked. Daniel nodded toward the front window. Grace stepped outside and froze. Above the door, the bakery sign had been repainted. In neat, bold letters, it now read, "Whitmore and Grace Bakery." Underneath, in smaller print, "Home of the Cookie Fairy." Grace turned to Daniel, her breath catching. "You didn't." "I did," he said softly. "Not as an owner, as a promise that no matter what happens, we're in this together." Ethan beamed. "It's our family name now." Grace's eyes filled, but her voice was steady. "Then I guess this place has 3 owners and a very good God watching over all of us." As the bell over the door rang and new customers stepped in, Grace felt something settle deep in her soul. A peace that had nothing to do with money or success or even cookies. It was the peace of knowing she was exactly where God meant her to be. One quiet Tuesday, Daniel and Ethan came in earlier than usual. Grace noticed Ethan tugging something through the door, a small keyboard in a case. "What's this?" she asked. Ethan grinned. "Dad says you should have music here. Cookies taste better with music." Daniel shrugged. "I remember you said you played piano. Thought maybe you'd share that gift with the bakery." Grace's eyes softened. "You didn't have to." He cut in gently. "Sometimes music says what words can't." That afternoon she played soft hymns as customers sipped coffee. The bakery felt warmer, fuller, almost like the music wove God's presence right into the walls. Ethan sat by the counter humming along. "See, Cookie Fairy and Music Fairy," he declared. 2 weeks later, Ethan came with a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a song request," he said shyly. Grace unfolded it. In Ethan's uneven handwriting, it read, "Can you play the song that makes my mom happy in heaven?" She looked at Daniel. He hesitated, then said, "It's called It Is Well With My Soul. My wife loved it." Grace nodded. That afternoon she played the hymn gently, letting every note be a prayer for peace. Daniel sat quietly, his eyes glistening.
When the last note faded, Ethan whispered, "I think she heard it." Grace smiled, heart full. "I know she did." Ethan's idea grew into a community event, music and cookies night. Grace cleared the front tables, set out candles, and invited locals to share songs. The evening was filled with laughter, off-key guitar, and harmonies that made the old walls vibrate. Toward the end, Daniel surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I don't sing, but tonight I'm grateful for someone who's brought music back into my life." He looked at Grace, "And I think we all know who that is." Grace felt her cheeks warm as the crowd applauded. One morning, a plain envelope arrived at the bakery. Inside was a letter in a handwriting Grace recognized instantly, her late mother's. It had been tucked away in an old recipe book Daniel had found while helping her reorganize. "Grace," it read, "don't be afraid to love with your whole heart. The right people will see your worth without you having to prove it." She read it 3 times before Daniel came in. Without a word, she handed it to him. He read it slowly, then met her eyes. She was right. In early December, the bakery faced another challenge, a blizzard warning that threatened to shut down the town during their busiest weekend. Grace gathered the staff and volunteers. "We'll prepare as much as we can, but let's pray too. God's brought us this far. He won't stop now." That night, snow fell thick and fast. But by morning, the streets were clear enough for people to come. The bakery was packed, warm both with heat and gratitude. Daniel leaned close and murmured, "Maybe it wasn't just the plows. Maybe someone up there knew we needed this day." Grace smiled. "I'm sure of it." On Christmas Eve, Daniel and Ethan brought Grace outside. Snowflakes drifted down, and she looked up to see a new wooden sign above the bakery's door. It read, "Cookies, Faith, and Love. A family recipe." Grace turned to Daniel, eyes bright. "When did you—" "Ethan's idea," he said, smiling at his son. Ethan beamed. "It's because you're family now, and family names go on the bakery." Grace felt her throat tighten. She pulled them both into a hug, the snow settling on their shoulders. In that moment, under the glow of the bakery lights, she knew her mother's prayer, and her own, had been answered. The idea began with Ethan. "Grace, you should do a Christmas concert," he said one morning while munching on a gingerbread cookie. "You can play, and Dad can, sit in the front and look proud." Daniel chuckled. "I can do that part." Grace hesitated. "I'm not sure people would come just to hear me." "They won't just hear you. They'll hear the story behind the music, the way God's used this bakery and you to change lives." So they planned. On the night before Christmas Eve, the bakery transformed into a small concert hall. Strings of lights draped across the ceiling, candles flickered on tables, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the air. Grace began with soft carols, her fingers finding the keys with a prayer in every note. Then she told stories about strangers who found warmth here, about a boy who rediscovered his voice in laughter, and about the God who never forgot them. When she played "It Is Well With My Soul," Daniel reached for Ethan's hand, and the boy leaned against his father. Grace caught the moment in her peripheral vision, and her heart swelled. After the final song, Daniel stepped forward. "This music doesn't just belong to Grace. It belongs to all of us who found a piece of home here." The applause was thunderous, but Grace knew the loudest sound was the quiet beat of 3 hearts perfectly in sync. Spring came early that year, and with it, a surprise. Daniel arrived one morning carrying a small box. "Grace," he began, his voice steady, but his eyes hopeful. "This bakery was the first place that felt like home after years of wandering in my own grief. You didn't just feed us, you loved us into life again. I can't imagine a single day without you." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "Will you marry me?" Grace's hands flew to her mouth. For a moment, all she could do was whisper, "Yes." The wedding took place in the bakery itself, surrounded by the smell of sugar and the hum of ovens. The guests were a mix of friends, customers, and townsfolk who had been part of their story from the start. Ethan stood proudly between them, holding the rings. "Daniel says I get to be best man and the cookie tester forever," he announced, making everyone laugh. When the vows were spoken and the kiss was sealed, Grace glanced up at the new sign Daniel had secretly added above the counter. It read, "Grace Whitmore, wife, mother, cookie fairy." Later that evening, as music played softly in the background and people danced between the tables, Grace stood in the doorway, looking out at the street bathed in golden light. Daniel slipped an arm around her. "Home," he murmured. Grace leaned into him. "Yes, home." In that moment, with laughter behind them and the quiet presence of God over them, they knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a life, sweet and whole, baked with faith, love, and second chances.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and leave a kind comment. To help the channel stay motivated to create more great videos, please hit the subscribe button. Wishing you happiness and peace in the light and love of God.